Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Cusack, Editor-in-Chief of The Hill. Thank you for joining us for our program today, The Hill's Disability Summit. We would like to thank Source America for their support of today's event. The Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law in 1990 and prohibits discrimination in employment against qualified individuals with disabilities. But last year, of the more than 20 million people with disabilities in the United States, only 19% were employed, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility across the federal workforce has been a focus for the Biden administration. How are federal agencies implementing accessibility into day-to-day work, and how can we leverage progress for disability employment? What will it take to address the historic inequities that persist in hiring? What are practical solutions to disability hiring, and how are public and private sector leaders modeling best practices? We will be putting these questions and more to our lineup of speakers. Before we get underway, just a reminder that you can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag The Hill Disability Advocacy. First, a quick intro video from our sponsor, Source America.
If you don't believe in people who are different from you, take the time to learn. Just spend one day with us. I will show you.
Over 60% of working-age people with disabilities in the U.S. do not have jobs.
You've got to know or educate yourself on what a person with a disability can do.
Everybody has their own strong points.
It's always worth to, educate others on what we're going through. Because if we don't, nobody else will.
People living with a disability are the largest minority group in the U.S. and around the world.
Living on my own, though, feels epic. So I get my own fridge in my own living room, and the rest is history.
We all work together. We all understand that we have something going on, and we do a pretty good job of taking care of one another.
You can get anyone with almost any disability, just a right structure, right layout, and they will be one of the best overall workers.
Up to 1 in 4 adults in the United States have some type of disability.
The confidence that they had in me said, oh, maybe I can do this. And if you believe in yourself, you can do it.
We're all people. We may look or sound different, but we're all one.
Joining me now is Congressman Mike Bost, the new chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee. As a veteran himself, who better to talk about the men and women who served our country? Welcome, Congressman.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, you have the gavel. Let's start off. What's your agenda for this Congress, for the committee?
Well, remember, there's several issues out there that we're going to be working on, expanding some new legislation moving forward. We're actually have moved a few pieces already, but what a lot of people don't realize, it's not just moving legislation, but it's dealing with legislation you've already passed. For instance, last year, if you'll remember, we passed the PACT Act. That is the taking care of the needs of those post 9/11 veterans who have had toxic exposure issues. We've got to make sure we give oversight to the VA to make sure that they're doing exactly what the legislation said needed to be done. When you're dealing with that, the other things that we're focusing on is our women veterans. Matter of fact, we just turned up the Women's Veterans Task Force today. The fastest growing group of veterans we have are our women's veterans. And unfortunately, many of our veterans facilities years ago, and they started correcting about 8 or 10 years ago, but we're starting to make sure, we are making sure that women feel comfortable going to receive their services from the VA. So we'll be pushing forward with that. There's several smaller pieces of legislation that are out there dealing with everything from things that the VA Cost Saving Enhancement Act was one of them. So that has to do with the fact that medical waste disposal. Most major medical places actually dispose of their medical waste on site. It's safer, it's cheaper. We're trying to make sure that that's done throughout the VA in all of our larger facilities. So there's smaller things like that we'll be moving, but most of it's oversight, making sure, and for the veterans that know it and deal with it in the 5 places they tried to turn it up, is the health records, the electronic health records. It's been a debacle from the very beginning. We're working to try to get that problem straightened out and not roll it out to other places until we do. So there's a lot of things on the burner out there.
That's a busy agenda, no doubt. What are the biggest impediments for veterans who are disabled to find jobs when they come back from combat?
Well, one thing is the misinterpretation that our veterans are, when they come back from combat, are broken. They're not. They're the best employees you can possibly have. They're the best employees because they know the importance of showing up on time, seeing what their mission is, moving forward, and fixing and working on the mission that's in front of them and doing it efficiently. Well, what we've done, though, is we're working on different programs. You know, I'm also on the Ag Committee, and there's a bill that we worked out there that we found out that something that's very good for veterans, and we need help in the ag industry because a lot of our younger generation are not staying with the family farm. And those places where it can work, there's a mentorship for veterans that go into the ag field. And what we find is if they suffer from post-traumatic stress, that is a natural help to work in the ag industry. You've got that, and then you've got Vet Tech, which is actually the speaker's bill originally. And it is a technical training that has a 75% success rating of placing our veterans in technical careers. What a fantastic thing we are doing there. So we've got to continue to look and help our veterans. Of course, the important thing is they need to know that this is available. So what we're doing with that is we're working with the Department of Defense on the TAP program. Now, the TAP program, the bad thing is sometimes you have one location that might have a very good TAP program, and others, they don't get all the information they need. So we're working to try to work with DOD so that if not 6 months, a year prior to the separation from the military, these veterans and their spouses are trained on what's available to them through the VA and what services are available to them, and it is a lot. But it's very difficult sometimes to get the DOD to do that, because you got to remember, whenever I left the Marine Corps, I tell people that I got a tap on the back from my commanding officer saying, "See you later, thanks." This is a true program for separation that allows them to understand what all benefits are there for them.
When you talk to veterans and disabled, there's the physical, there's also mental. We're coming out of COVID-19, which has been tough on everybody, especially veterans who have been obviously grappling. The rate of suicide is unacceptable. What are you hearing from them in frustration? You mentioned some of it is that they don't know where to go. Is it education? Is it just Washington bureaucracy?
It is. We are going to, that's the idea behind the TAP program. And understand the numbers right now, and you don't get those numbers until 2 years after the fact. So we're running on 2020 numbers right now. And those numbers were lower. They went from like 20 down to 17. But of those, only there are 6 of those when you check on them, and they didn't never even go to the VA or receive services from the VA at all. Now, a lot of that has to do with education when they get out. That's what we talked about the TAP Act. A lot of that has to do with, I believe, that maybe your first experience with the VA, which could have been the GI Bill, it wasn't a good one. And so you think, I'm just not going to see that. But then there's another issue out there that I'm working on. And a lot of people don't know this, and I didn't know it until I got to Congress 9 years ago. Back years ago, after then President Reagan was shot, if you remember, Brady went through a process of making up all these, what was known as the Brady bills. And one of those was interpreted by the VA that if you seek help from the VA and you are having trouble with your finances and you actually are assigned a fiduciary, your name is automatically turned into the next list and you lose your Second Amendment rights. Nobody has to say you're a danger to yourself or you're a danger to others, and you do it without due process. And it's amazing to me that that occurs with veterans who fought for those rights, and they're the only ones that wouldn't get due process if they seek the help from the VA. What the problem is that veterans talk to each other at the VA, at our VFWs, at the Legion, at the barbershop, at the coffee shop. They talk to each other. And many of our veterans then don't seek the help that they're available to them. So I am I'm carrying a bill that actually is to stop that practice, that actually gives our veterans due process. They can still have a fiduciary. They're not automatically assigned to be taken to the next list. And the only way they are is exactly like any other citizen. Someone has to decide to challenge them on the fact that they're a danger to themselves or a danger to others, family member, it could be a professional. Then that is taken to a court of law, and then that court can decide on whether or not that person needs to be have their Second Amendment rights taken.
And is that legislation bipartisan, and what's the timeline for it?
As of right now, it is only Republican sponsors. I gladly put any Democrat on it that would want to be on it. I know that if you are a person that, quite often we have a difference, not necessarily in Republican and Democrat, but those areas that understand gun law and those areas that don't. And if you're from flyover country, that's where you see the people not seeking help from the VA because they know about that.
And what's your relationship with the leadership of VA, Dennis McDonough? That's obviously, these issues should be bipartisan, but obviously politics creeps into almost everything. I know you've passed a handful of bipartisan bills already sent to the Senate, right, which is pretty good. But what is the relationship with you and the administration on veteran affairs issues? It's
actually very good. Let me tell you that the Secretary and you've got to realize that I actually was in the state legislature with his former boss. Remember, his former boss was President Barack Obama.
Yes, indeed.
The former president and I served together in Illinois. We played basketball in the morning and cards in the evening together. I didn't vote for him, just to let you know that. But, so we have that in common, that we have a friendship with his former boss. But let me tell you that the Secretary has been very fair with me. And it's a great relationship in the fact that he doesn't blindside me with anything. I don't blindside him with anything. We see common ground where we can work together. And those areas where we disagree, he and I talk in advance so that I can prepare to have my rebuttal if they all of a sudden start to do something. And so far it's been fairly small things. Well, no, they're pretty big things. I know, and I still believe, that there was a law in 1992 that the VA cannot perform abortions. And I will continue to fight them on that issue because they are now performing abortions. But I am also asking for information on what abortions are performed, how many, not names, because that would be illegal and we're not going to go down that path. But, we need to know how many times, as far as I'm concerned, they're violating the law. And that's money being spent that could be spent otherwise.
And that's very important. The heads up in Washington is always very important, and good to see that obviously you fight on some issues. You have been critical of President Biden's budget, specifically in this space. A little gimmicky. What do you think Congress needs to change it?
Let me explain that.
Yeah.
So when we passed the PACT Act, okay, it gave the ability to the Secretary to move money over into the Toxic Exposure Fund. And the Toxic Exposure Fund actually becomes it is a mandatory spending. So you're moving things from mandatory or from discretionary fund over to mandatory, and things that would have been paid for anyway. And it's kind of like it gives an opportunity for a shell game to hide certain things and not saying that this secretary is doing it, because we're watching the line item pretty close. but I don't know who's going to be there 6 months down the road, 2 years down the road. Or the bureaucrats that are underneath the secretary that send that budget to us. What are they trying to hide when our job is oversight? So I'm going to be very, very cautious on that. Our staff is working diligently to make sure we watch every line item. But let me tell you that in today's hearing, the ranking member Takano agreed that he didn't think that was the intent. Now the secretary said, well, the law gave him the power to do that. Well, I understand, but if the law gives you the power to do something, doesn't mean you automatically start doing it. It means you do it if it's necessary, but you need to explain why it's necessary.
Mm-hmm. What's your message when you hear from and veterans watching this, if they're disabled and they want to get their health care? What do you tell them to do? They're going through their own struggles. They don't know how to navigate the Washington system. What's your 30,000 feet advice for them?
Get your help. Get some help from your local VSOs to have walked through this. They are out there. They're great. They're available to you. Understand that their service is free to you. Please seek that. I know it's difficult because I had to apply for a disability years ago, did not get it, still don't have it, but I knew what that paperwork was like to deal with that on the appeals process. We have streamlined that appeals process, but quite often, regardless of what the services you're going to be receiving from the VA, you may need help navigating that. Reach out to your VFW or your Legion or any other VSOs that are out there. And believe me, there's lots of them. Seek help. If you're now in the process of separating, listen and study and get all the information you can from TAP. And understand those services are available to you. Make sure you know each one of those and what they are.
Last question. Many companies have given back and they participate in public-private partnerships for veterans. What's their role and how important is that in getting veterans the help they need? It's
very important. Lots of the private company. Well, understand there's actual companies. We're trying to deal with that to make sure that the veterans aren't. If you're talking about the services and them training them services, well, we're trying to make sure that that it is for the benefit of the veteran and not necessarily for the benefit of the company. Now, if you're talking about those companies that actually encourage hiring vets and providing education to vets and making sure that veterans are moved from that military mindset over to the workforce, whether it's in everything from air pilots to trucking to management positions. There are so many companies out there that are aggressively pursuing to have veterans as their employees. They're great, and we want to work with them as much as we can.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
And now another message from our sponsor, Source America, featuring Richard Belden, President and CEO of Source America, in conversation with various disability advocates.
Morning, what's up, Austin? Some people don't give people with disabilities even a chance. They're like, oh, nope, they can't do it. I don't really like being limited or being put in a box. I want to be able to do any and everything. Thank you for helping me train Clifton. I appreciate you.
For Kendra Scott and many other people with disabilities, having a job can be life-changing. It offers independence, opportunities to contribute to society, and personal and professional growth. A more inclusive workforce also creates larger economic and societal benefits that are often overlooked.
I think if you have an inclusive workforce, your organization is healthier. I think there's a greater respect for all people, and the studies have shown that a more inclusive organization is a more productive organization.
Employing people with disabilities offers many advantages. However, the reality is that disability is often only a small portion of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts.
Diversity and inclusion is talked about all the time now, but rarely do they take that a step into supporting people with disabilities.
Outdated stereotypes that people with disabilities cannot do the job, and a persistent misunderstanding of what is needed to employ a person with a disability remain major obstacles to hiring advances.
The average accommodation is about $500 per employee with disability. It's really not a lot of money to make your workplace accommodating for someone with disability.
Now I'm here just doing what I want to do. It's the job that I've always wanted to do, and I'm here to do it.
As a leader in employing people with disabilities, Source America has connected people with disabilities to meaningful jobs for almost 50 years through contracts with the federal government and private sector. Source America is one of 2 central nonprofits in the federal Ability One program. There are approximately 36,000 Ability One employees with disabilities in their network of nearly 400 Ability One authorized providers.
There are tens of thousands of additional people that could benefit from an Ability One job through the federal government. These are solid, long-term jobs that pay a market wage, require a skill set and a dedication and commitment by the individuals. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity for the federal government to truly become, a more inclusive organization.
Welcome to Advocacy 101. It's important to speak for yourself. You have a voice. I'm here to speak on behalf of myself and my fellow coworkers back in Albuquerque. I was in Washington, D.C. with a group of people with disabilities who were too scared to speak. So I got up and started chanting, "Let your story be heard. Let your story be heard." And then people started chanting with me, and then one by one they got up and started speaking. That was awesome.
Another key component in overcoming misperceptions is providing a platform for people with disabilities like Menard Martinez to advocate directly to policymakers and employers.
I've been advocating since I was a child for different opportunities when they came up in my life, all the way to my role here at Source America. It's been very powerful to be able to help people build their confidence, to be able to give them the ability to tell their own story. It's something that they live every day, and learning to be an advocate is just so important, whether it's a small issue or a big issue.
Advocacy can also help fight against perceived stigmas. For many, the fear of being labeled or compartmentalized can be its own roadblock to employment. This dynamic can be especially true for veterans with disabilities.
Nobody wants to walk around stating I have a disability. They feel that it's going to be held against them on a promotion, on any kind of other opportunities forthcoming within the company. Somebody needs to know, because there's resources out there to help.
There are over 5,000 veterans in the Source America network, including over 2,000 with disabilities. Veteran and Purple Heart recipient Larry Robinson is one of them. With asthma and PTSD from his life in the service, Larry had difficulty finding work in the civilian world.
When you come back from over there and walk across that parade field and the family's there, the band is playing and people are cheering and the governor's waiting to shake your hand, you feel 10 feet tall. But then after you turn in your weapon and leave that parade field, it was frustrating coming back.
Larry eventually got a job as a general clerk at Nobis Enterprises. His co-workers say he has not only excelled at his position, but his years in the military have given him a passion for team and morale building.
I think we've been part of the solution, and people are starting to understand more and more. There's lots of opportunities to partner and help people with disabilities earn higher wages, save for retirement, move up in their jobs.
Everybody deserves the chance to work, and giving somebody a chance to work gives them a sense of pride, and it gives them a reason to wake up, if you will, and be a part of the world that everybody else is a part of.
The disability community is an untapped resource that truly has much talent to be had, and shame on us if we don't figure out collectively between the federal government and the businesses how to reach out and utilize that untapped talent pool to fill many of the jobs that right now are going unfilled. It's just it's a perfect crossroads.
All I want out of life is to be somebody who's creating change and who's moving forward and pushing other people to do better and be better people. That is my goal.
Thanks again to Richard Belden and Source America for their support of today's discussions. We are now joined by our panelists to discuss practical solutions for increasing employment across the disability community. Welcome Rhiannon Parker, Chief Innovation Officer of the Valuable 500, a business network supporting disability inclusion. Armando Contreras is President and CEO of United Cerebral Palsy. He also serves on the board of Source America, the sponsor of today's event. And from the White House, Day Al Mohammed, Director of Disability Policy for the Domestic Policy Council. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Rhiannon, I want to start with you. Where are we as far as the business world and the disability community as far as employment?
I think it's really important to recognize that there's a continuum of maturity within the corporate community. So we see some exceptional progress, and we also see some organizations just starting their journey. And with the Valuable 500, it's our job to work alongside these companies and the corporate community to push them towards best practice and kind of catalyze innovation and catalyze the transfer of knowledge and innovation within that community.
And when you're talking about business, are we talking about large businesses, small business, medium, or all of the above?
So within the Valuable 500, our members are a minimum of 1,000 employees. So that's the kind of the ecosystem that we work within. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that it can be a small to medium enterprise all the way up to multinationals that are engaged in this work. You can start anywhere.
And before we go to the other panelists, just how do other companies learn from each other? Is that part of what your organization does, best practices and what works and what doesn't?
Absolutely. So we see some really cool things happening. We see innovation clustering around industry. We see innovation clustering around geography, and sometimes around a topic. So we may see organizations from completely disparate areas within our network doing some incredible work on procurement or hiring practices. And so our job is to bring those companies together and get those conversations going and progress the work.
Armando, you just released your, quote, Care for Inclusion report. Can you tell us what the findings/takeaways have been?
Yes, that's the Case for Inclusion, and that's a partnership with ANCOR and the ANCOR Foundation. Well, the findings were not really good, because what we're looking at is the plight of the direct service or the direct support professional. That one is underpaid. Second, the majority of these support professionals are either Black or Latina women, and they are the ones that are supporting those that are looking for work and those with disabilities. And that's a major part of the services that we provide. Our 56 affiliates in the United States, 2 of them in Canada. We are the ones that provide that type of service in the United States. And there is a major concern of the Medicaid reimbursement is not reimbursing to the rate that they should be getting paid for the phenomenal work that they're doing in the United States.
Well, yeah, along those lines, over 1 million home care workers make a median hourly wage of $13 an hour. What is the effect when you have that kind of a low wage on quality of care?
Well, one, it's poverty level. How can we actually begin to support people who day in and day out are with children and adults with various disabilities and pay them a meaningful wage for what they do? The issue, Bob, is that they will then look for other work, and it could be in the store, Walmart, Amazon industry, that for a few dollars more, they're actually leaving an industry that is dire to the United States and dire to the families that we support.
Day, I want to go to you as far as your position and your portfolio on the Domestic Policy Council. Can you tell us a little bit about it? I imagine some people don't know that this is a big role on the council.
Sure. In some ways, the Domestic Policy Council's job and mission is to help kind of drive the administration's policy agenda from a cross-governmental perspective, right? When we think about the federal government, we think about it as a single unit, but the problem is we've got many, many departments and agencies, and they're all slightly different. And the idea is when you want to do something big, which this president has done in many ways, when you want to push on things like mental health or access or equity, to be effective, you have to be consistent. And so in many ways, the Domestic Policy Council operates to try and ensure that kind of consistency and to drive an agenda that ensures we're all like walking the walk.
As far as working with different government agencies, as you mentioned, I mean, how is the cooperation? Is that something that you work on to come up with goals and solutions to get more people with disabilities jobs?
I'd say yes, and my role is as the Director of Disability Policy. So basically what that means is if it covers anything to do with disability, whether that's employment, education, healthcare, all of it. And in many ways, you can't deal with an individual in one arena without seeing how it touches everything, because our lives are all interconnected to a variety of arenas. So you do end up having to do a lot of that. But I think maybe the best example of where you'll see things that the Domestic Policy Council will help drive would be in support of, let's say, the president's Executive Order 14035 on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, the EIA, which was created to cultivate a federal workforce that draws on the full diversity of a nation, right? The idea is we should look like the people. But to make that work, how do you make that work? And I think one of the first things we're looking at is that old adage, what gets measured gets done. And so over the last year, individual agencies have crafted concrete plans to embed that DEIA EO into their recruitment, their hiring, their development, and their retention of talent. It's been included in the Federal Employment Viewpoint Survey. And that sounds like a small thing, but that is the largest cross-government organizational climate survey. And it assesses how employees experience all the different policies and practices and procedures that their agency and its leadership are implementing. And like I said, about consistency to ensure it, I think I want to establish a highlight that we recently established the Chief Diversity Officer Executive Council. Many different agencies hired a Chief Diversity Officer, but if it's just working by themselves in their department or their agency, they might be doing great things, but it's not working across government. They might not be doing as great things, but this allows it to have that kind of communication. But all of these are about making sure we have a good baseline to work from. And I think one of the toughest things is many folks aren't even starting with knowledge of that demographic as it applies to disability. So that's probably the biggest example I can say about how the Domestic Policy Council can work across government, because all of those three actions are to try and make sure that as an entire federal system, we are pushing disability employment and inclusion forward together.
Rhiannon, many companies are focused on diversity and inclusion, especially after the death of George Floyd, and that's very important. You hear less talk, though, of getting people with disabilities into the workforce. Companies are not as outspoken on that, I would say. Why is that?
So I think first and foremost, there's a discomfort with understanding disability. We hear companies and individuals within those companies that are not even sure if it's okay to say the word disabled, right? So I think that very often there are good intentions, but there is just an inherent discomfort and a lack of knowledge of the disability community and the richness that is there, right? So we often hear comparisons to gender and ethnicity data, and but a lack of understanding of what it actually takes to create a culture of trust, where an employee is willing to join that organization, organizations that have the intent to do the right thing, and so they hire inclusively, but once those candidates are in, it's not a culture or an environment in which they can thrive. And so really it starts there with understanding the community. I think we're seeing a lot of organizations on a journey, kind of starting to move away from the medical model and the charitable model, and really being well versed in the social model of disability, which is great, but what we're pushing for is the human right of disability, right? So understanding that there is nobody more well suited or no better expert on their experience of disability than a disabled individual themselves, right? So it takes a commitment, and it takes a level of comfort in just sitting amongst stuff that you don't know and acknowledging that and working with the community to listen.
So Rihanna, as far as finding the talent, the employee, and matching that person with the employer, what are some good programs that you've come across? What works? How do you do that?
So I think it starts with the acknowledgement that, the ways of working or what we've done in the past may not be what works now, right? So we've seen some great examples of inclusive hiring platforms. We see changes to language, changes to verbiage in hiring practices, things that people don't even understand makes a difference. So if you say, must have excellent verbal and written skills, well, is that actually something that is requisite of the role? And, what can we do to change that and make that more inclusive based on what the expectations are for that individual to succeed? I think organizations that are very clear and committed to reasonable adjustments and, really making that available to everyone without a lot of admin or administrative burden on the individual, those are the ones that we're really seeing thrive and create an environment where they can recruit and retain talent. And I think certainly those that acknowledge that, the disability community deserves equitable pay and are looking at how that exists within their supply chain, asking the tough questions, are these suppliers, whether they're tier 1 or tier 2, those that are 14C certificate holders, what is going on here, right? So the ones that take an interest in the data and acknowledge that it goes beyond them as employers, but also extends to their supply chains. Those are the ones that we really see creating great working environments to attract disabled talent.
Armando, what do you think as far as policymakers, Congress, the White House, states, at the state legislature? What are you looking for? I imagine part of it is certainly passing something that would lift wages, a minimum wage to begin with, but I'll let you talk for yourself.
Yeah, it's going to be a collaborative effort of the states, federal government, to begin to look at legislation. And a couple of key points that come out of our report is, one, having grant programs to support training for people with disabilities to get into meaningful jobs. Then also what's been coming up in this dialogue amongst our affiliates, and we are going to, next year marks our 75th anniversary, is that while we've come a long way during the pandemic and during the last 2.5 years, that's been a brutal event and a point in our 75 years that has affected our staff, our support work, and we have vacancies that can be anywhere between 10, 20, 40, 50% vacancies. So we're hoping too that the Congress would expand opportunities for people entering the United States to join the support workforce. So that's another piece that we would want. The bigger piece really for us too is that Congress should pass legislation to increase the share of Medicaid funding for home and community-based services. One example is the Senator Casey and Representative Dingell, the HCBS Access Act, that will fund $400 billion, and that's with the B, to home community-based services, so that the direct service professionals can get paid an adequate and meaningful pay that they can not be in the poverty levels that I mentioned before. And that would be a major impact to people that we serve and others serve in the nation.
Day, well, that's a nice setup for you. What do you think of that legislation? It's got over 70 co-sponsors in the House, and it's got a decent amount. Not yet a bipartisan bill, but is the White House open to that legislation?
I think in general, I think we know the president has been supportive of supporting home care workers, and home and community-based services in general. So I think that in general, the idea is absolutely we want to see people have the care and support they need to be successful and independent.
Dave, what do you think are the biggest obstacles that must be tackled in both the short and long term for the disabled community?
That is a very big question.
You've got 10 seconds. No, I'm just kidding. No,
yeah.
Take as much time as you want.
Yeah, I think the difficulty is in many ways there are many things that will make a difference when it applies to disability employment, and the problem is you can't just work in one arena. Armando talked specifically about the idea of home care supports, and if you can't get out of bed in the morning, there's absolutely no way you're going to be able to work. If you're addressing, and this is the culture that Rhiannon talked about, if we are dealing with stigma and discrimination in the workplace, then it's going to be impossible to find a job. If you can't access training and employment services, you're not going to be able to. If you can't get a good, solid education, and the problem is there are pieces of everything. And a lot of times when we're working, we end up seeing the end result and we try to fix there. But the truth is, I think we need to put effort forward a little bit in each of these areas actually will move it forward. When it applies to disability, just like for any other underserved or disadvantaged population, the idea is we have to start at the beginning to be successful and go, what are all the pieces that lead up to it? And unfortunately, that's not an easy answer, and it's not one that's very sexy. You know, you want to be able to say, this will do it. And the tough part is it's going to take a little bit of everything.
Dave, as far as the government agencies that you work with, I mean, are they talking to one another? And which are the key ones? I know every agency's got to focus on this, but I would imagine it's Department of Labor and HHS and perhaps a few others. And are they less siloed than they used to be on this issue?
Actually, I would say one of the things I am very, very proud of, in particular, I think this administration more than any other, the Biden-Harris administration has really reinforced the whole cross-government and all of government in many, many of its activities. And actually, I can give one really good example, which is the Department of Labor's Good Jobs Initiative. And so basically what it is the Department of Labor's agencies are working with transportation, commerce, and energy to expand workforce access for all workers, including workers with disabilities. And basically, I think, I'm trying to think of the numbers. I think to date it is working collaboration to incentivize equity. It's in Good Jobs in over, I think, $97 billion of competitive grant funding, right? These are the investments from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. And so the idea is to say, you know, what can we do to help support employment? Because the money that's going to these other agencies, it's going to be used for contracting, it's going to be for procurement, it's going to be for construction, it is building things. And we need to make sure that everyone has a piece of that. And I think in many ways, the Good Jobs Initiative is is a good exemplar of that kind of cross-government work.
Rhiannon, as far as question to you about what policymakers should do, making it easier to improve quality of life, but also maybe eliminating red tape for the business world, what do you think that policymakers should do, whether that's at the federal or state level?
I think really the policies lay the foundation for, you know, the private sector, right? So it's really an incredible experience to work with some of the, you know, the people laying those foundations and doing the hard work and see how that's expressed in the corporate community. So for us, it really starts with things like ending 14C and, you know, all of the different things that we want to see happening. And then it's our job as the corporate community to basically make sure that that's articulated, right? So yeah, I think it's businesses' responsibility and the corporate community's responsibility to take policies and obviously ensure that they comply with them, but to use that as a framework or a platform to progress towards best practice. And so just looking at what Day was saying, there are many corollaries with the corporate community in ensuring the standardization of approach. And we see this particularly in regard to data. So we recently launched 5 KPIs specific to disability performance that we're asking all of our 500 companies to work towards. So these are looking at representation, so workforce representation and the percentage of the workforce that self-identify as disabled, the presence of an employee resource group, looking at what training is provided to understand and really prepare leadership for building disability inclusive organizations, setting goals, right? So disability inclusive specific goals that allow them to maintain their autonomy, but also to really commit to things that are specific to disability performance. And finally, looking at digital accessibility. So it's really important that we get this data into the ecosystem and then we can actually look at it and measure, right? So we hear this all the time, what gets measured gets managed. So I think this is very important to understand the current state of play.
Armando, I just want to talk to you about COVID-19. You mentioned that has been devastating. It's been very difficult on so many people, so many kids, mentally, physically. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And are we coming out of that now that life is kind of back to normal?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Bob, that we're coming out of it yet. But I could say, and I want to go back to what Day had mentioned about what gets measured, gets done, or gets the awareness, is that we realize that there's data that we couldn't access, especially in the communities, the Black communities, Latino communities, African American communities, of what COVID really did. And it was devastating, where the effects, what we had called, and I think somebody had coined it, double or the triple burden of effects of people with disabilities that happen to be of color, that they didn't have access to vaccines, that they didn't have access to proper care, access to transportation. Many of them passed away. So those were the things that United Cerebral Palsy and other partners that we have, like Access, the ARC, ANCOR, that we were really pushing for. Where's the issue? Where's the data? How can we make a huge difference? As far as the workforce and people providing direct services like United Cerebral Palsy, a huge impact, because the workforce was getting sick. The workforce had to rely on policies and regulations that did not allow them to go to work for good reason, obviously, so it didn't spread. So if there are not enough care workers out there, still the case today, then that affects the quality of care for people with disabilities. So I would say that we're still far away from saying that COVID has now gone away. And then we have to deal, and thanks to the White House that has been doing a great job on this, is long COVID, right? The resources that the White House has done to bring awareness to long COVID, a new disability, actually. So there are people out there that perhaps were never categorized as having a disability, now with long COVID have a disability. So the impact from COVID was really a dire impact to people with disabilities, to our workforce, and to our affiliates and other great organizations out there that continue to provide care and vital care for and programs to people with disabilities.
Day, last question to you. Just with the aging population, we talked about the workforce issues and the pay, the low pay. This is so important. I mean, this is going to have to be addressed over the next 3 to 7 years, right? Because otherwise, we're looking at some major problems down the road.
I think at the end of the day, what I also want is folks to have long, healthy, meaningful lives, to be able to provide for their families, to work, to be productive and independent citizenry. And the idea is, right now we have a system that is based very much on what you contribute to the system. And the idea is, how do you get the best out of every individual? How can people bring their best to the table? And when you talk about a timeline for that, I'm like, I think there always feels like there's a short timeline. And I think the truth is, every generation, we're going to keep having different roadblocks and different issues, but we also have some of those same issues. And part of it is getting to that original baseline issue and making sure we have the information and the awareness, such as doing that kind of demographics tracking things, making sure we are providing information and awareness so that way people know. The idea of disability, many of our laws on disability go back to 1938 and are still on the books. So we're still operating from a model from many, many years ago. And so the idea is we should be growing and changing and evolving, and we should keep making those changes. So if you're saying we need to make changes in the next 3, absolutely we should. Just like the idea is we want to give everyone that kind of opportunity. And everyone talks about that cheesy idea of the American dream, but it is very real. And the idea is that we should be able to let everyone have the opportunity to reach for that. And I think in many ways that's a responsibility we all have. And I think when we talk about that culture of inclusion, right, it is not the diversity worker, it's not the disability employee whose job it is everyone. Everyone has a piece of that. Because that's the only way to guarantee success, is to make sure we all can move forward together.
Great
it's not
panel
a zero-sum
discussion.
game.
We've run out of time, unfortunately, but I want to thank all 3 of you. Important topic, and obviously one we will continue to discuss in coming years. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My last guest is Congresswoman Debbie Dingell from Michigan. She is the co-chair of the Bipartisan Disabilities Caucus. She is a fierce advocate for equity, inclusion, and accessibility for all. Congresswoman, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here with you. Thanks for doing this.
Absolutely. Well, I first want to, can you talk a little bit about the Disabilities Caucus and why this issue is so important to you?
Well, to tell you the truth, I was very touched. Jim Langevin founded this caucus, who was the first paraplegic to be elected to Congress. And when he decided to retire, he asked me if I would replace him, which was a very significant honor, quite frankly, because there was no louder voice than he for those with disabilities. But I was married to a man that I loved with all my heart and all my soul, who was a vigorous outdoorsman, who in the last few years of his life began to have problems getting around. It was very hard for him. And I suddenly became part of the process of trying to navigate how you get help, how you find people to help you. I realized how broken this system is, how it's impossible to navigate. There were days, I'm supposed to know, I'm luckier than 99 and 9/10 of the people in this country. And there were days that I would pound my head against the wall. I would just be in tears. I would punch so many buttons trying to get through to somebody to get help, and they kept just referring you to somebody else. And it has made me a true advocate. And I don't think you realize how broken the system is until you have had to try to navigate it. And it's made me a very loud spokesperson for this community.
And, you know, along those lines, I think we've all experienced it, especially those who are older like me. And, you know, just when you have to deal with loved ones, you know, caregiving is so exhausting, but it also highlights how important caregivers they are. And what do you think, we policymakers should be doing? Because we've got an aging population, we've got a workforce that's not going to be as large, and these caregivers are not making a lot of money, and that impacts patients.
So I'm going to start by responding to that with a couple of things that I deeply believe, which is caregiving makes all other work possible. When someone is not worried about those that they love, be it somebody young, be it someone that is older, someone with disabilities. And most people do not realize that right now, 54% of people over 50 are helping to care for someone with a disability. And COVID has really put a great deal of pressure on the system. There are too many caregivers, spouses that are exhausted, can't get any respite care, can't find anybody to help them take care of their loved ones. Now, I have a bill that I introduced with Bob Casey, which is the home-based community care bill, which does more than one thing. One, this current system we have is designed for institutional care. And there are a lot of people that want to stay in their own homes, in their own community settings. Fact of the matter is, it actually can save the system money. We have almost 1 million people that are on waiting lists to be in their own home care system. We also don't pay caregivers enough. I had people, I was lucky I had one woman that's still part of my family, but I needed to hire people to help supplement that. At the end, I was able to take care of them, but if I couldn't be there, John couldn't be alone. And I had people that were working for me that were working 2-3 jobs and still living below the poverty line. We need to recognize that caregiving is one of the most important jobs we have in our society, and we need to pay people what they're worth. We need to respect caregivers.
So, Congresswoman, caring for your husband, John Dingell, legend in politics on Capitol Hill, that was an eye-opening situation, because really, unless you go through the process, and I hadn't been through the process until COVID, when my parents were going through some difficulties, you really don't see the flaws in the healthcare system unless it's one of your loved ones.
You don't understand it until you're hands-on. I had friends who would tell me about when one of their parents became sick and the spouse was taking care of them, which is another issue, by the way, that I am working on, is that they had to get rid of all their assets to be able to afford for someone with Alzheimer's or someone with a more serious issue to even be able to get long-term care. Intellectually, I had heard that story, but I didn't really understand it until I had to take care of John. The day after he finished his work, he cast his last vote, the doctors told me that he may have finished his life's work and they thought he might die that weekend. He didn't. He came back, but I had to get physical therapy for him. He had a broken hip. Well, you've got a system that is 90 days and you're up. There's nothing's covered. You don't know how to find the caregiver. You don't know how to get the physical therapy. I would talk to Medicare, and Medicare would say it's private insurance. Private insurance would say it was Medicare. And think about it. I was a congresswoman married to somebody that had been a congressman, and I couldn't get the system to work. And the next 4 years, I met many people. I used to joke with John that taking him to the doctor was as good as having a town hall meeting, because person after person told me their story. And we really do not understand how hard it is in so many different ways of somebody who needs help, either it be a senior or somebody that is disabled. And a second issue is that I'm trying to get this bill permanently reauthorized. We've been able to get it extended, is the spousal impoverishment program. For too long, a spouse of someone who needed long-term care had to have no assets to get care. Medicaid is the largest provider of long-term care in this country.
speaking on the healthcare system, it is so crazy that people have to get rid of assets to get healthcare they need. Having a job is tied to healthcare, but that's the system we have now. When you look, though, with people with disabilities and the stats of unemployment, it's just striking and staggering, these numbers. What do you think the business community could do, or the role of public-private partnerships to improve these devastating numbers?
Well, I think, look, I would encourage employers to look at hiring people with disabilities. We've made great progress since the first legislation was passed, but we know now that we have a shortage of workers in too many businesses and industry. And there's so many smart, talented people that have a mobility issue or a different kind of disability issues, but they're very capable of a whole lot of different jobs. We need to partner with businesses to make sure that every human being in our country has a productive member of the workforce. And quite frankly, many people with disabilities are a source of incredible workers that will outdo anyone.
What about the stigma of having a disability? Mental health, that's also been a stigma. I think it's helped a little bit through COVID because people have been more open about their mental health struggles. Mental health can also be a disability. Can you talk a little bit about that stigma and getting rid of it?
We don't traditionally think of mental health issues per se as someone with a disability, but there are many, many that are struggling. And for too long, I'm not old, but I'm seasoned. You just simply didn't talk about it. You couldn't admit that you were depressed or suffering from anxiety. And by the way, I think and believe that a lot of people who suffer from drug addiction or alcoholism are self-treating themselves. They're drinking or taking pills to take that edge off of anxiety or to give them the bump that they need from depression. Mental health is just like a physical illness. We need to remove that stigma. I have, in recent years, talked about my own father, who was an opioid drug addict, and my sister, who committed suicide. I believe both of them my father was probably bipolar, my sister, not at least bipolar. And nobody talked about it. Nobody would acknowledge that people had a problem. We've got to, and I talk about it because we've got to take the stigma off. We need to be willing to acknowledge that people have issues, are struggling, need a helping hand, need people to be empathetic and compassionate. It should never be something that keeps someone back. We need to be putting far more resources into mental health issues.
As you know, Congresswoman, we're living in very polarizing times, but the Disabilities Caucus is bipartisan. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because while health care and the Affordable Care Act has been a partisan battle, there have been other bills like the 21st Century Cures Act on health care that actually do attract bipartisanship. And I imagine you have so many colleagues on the other side of the aisle who also have gone through what you experienced with your husband and want to get some stuff done.
Each of these experiences is different experiences. Brian Fitzpatrick is my co-chair, and I'm so honored to serve with him. And he's had a brother who suffers from a disability, and he's very open and honest in talking about those experiences. But with all of these issues that we are talking about, there isn't a family that isn't touched by some aspect of this, be it an aging parent, be it with someone that has a physical disability, struggling with depression or mental health, all these issues that you've talked about. And there are a lot of people. Fred Upton, who was one of my dearest friends, who was actually the author of the 21st Century Cures Bill, he worked on that so hard. He brought people together. He invested in answers to so many important research in so many different diseases. So I think when you're talking about the issues that we are talking about, there isn't a family. We don't look at these issues as a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. These are issues that every family in this country and in the world experience in some way.
Now, your legislation, as you mentioned, it's got an impressive number of co-sponsors already in the new year, 74, I just checked. But they're all Democrats or independents, whether that's in the Senate or the House. Angus King, Bernie Sanders, independents are on it. Do you think you can get a Republican backer of that? And what's your strategy for passing this type of bill? Would you attach it to something that's moving later on this year?
So first of all, I'm always somebody who tries to work across the aisle. So I'm talking to a number of my colleagues and asking them to look at it and consider being a co-sponsor. And I'm going to work with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to determine what's the best way to get this passed, and work with Bob Casey in the Senate. So anybody who knows me knows that I'm someone that talks to everybody, sits down, says, how do we address that? There are needs that need to be met. And we're going to figure out how we get it over the finish line. We came close last year, but the problems are getting worse, not better.
And that they are, without a doubt. And, you know, the Congress did pass a while back the Americans with Disability Act. Is Congress going to have to do something else big along those lines to make more progress, or can it be done incrementally? Because in the next 5 to 10 years, you have more people retiring, you're going to have more people with disabilities, and you're going to have potentially a shortage of healthcare workers. It's
not potential, it's already real. I was very struck this fall. Every time I picked up the newspaper, New York Times, Washington Post, newspapers across the country were talking about the crisis in caregiving. So it's here. I'm not somebody that is going to predict now how we're going to get this done. I'm not afraid of incremental steps, and I'm not afraid of a big bill. What we got to do is understand we have a crisis that needs to have us work together to address the solutions. And you are correct. The baby boomers are getting older. They need help, and we've got to do something about it. So I'm focused on, I don't need fireworks. I don't need big. I need to figure out how we're going to get the job done, and that's what I'm focused on.
And a big part, well, at least some people point to, healthcare workers need to get better compensated. I know that Democrats have been pushing for federal minimums as far as minimum wage. Is that something that Democrats are going to keep the pressure on? Divided government's very hard to move anything, but do you think eventually you're going to win that battle?
Well, I do think we should be paying a minimum wage, but for so many of these care workers, you don't understand because they have no benefits. I've met so many of the care workers over the last few years who have children of their own. They're struggling. They're living below the poverty line, and they're working harder than anybody I know. They don't have health care. They're afraid. By the way, I'll give you one of the problems. You've got people who are going, some of the people that worked for me, and it was a problem during COVID, would be going in and out of different homes, different institutions, and became germ spreaders. But they could not, if they were sick, they couldn't take a day off. There was no replacement for that income. Too many of these workers, they have no health insurance. They can't afford to go to the doctor. They can't admit that they're sick. They can't get medicine. And none of them have retirement or pensions or any kind of thing like that. We need to understand how important these people are in our lives on a daily basis. We need to respect a caregiver and what they do for us and pay them a decent wage and give them benefits like all workers deserve.
Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to Source America and to all of you for watching. For those of you who missed any of the conversations this afternoon, we will have the video from the event up on our website, thehill.com, shortly. I'm Bob Cusack. Have a great rest of your day.